Welcome to the Leaders in Literacy webinar series by Lindamood-Bell. My name is Dave Kivita, and I'm the Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. It's my honor and privilege to be joined today by a person I now consider a good friend and colleague, the Honorable Dr. Robert Pasternack, and among many other roles, Bob is the former Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the United States Department of Education. And Bob was really instrumental in getting response to intervention put into the 2004 reauthorization of IDEA. And we thought it would be a great opportunity to have Bob come and talk a bit about the current landscape of, in particular, reading instruction in the United States, in particular in response to how the pandemic has really exacerbated many of the issues that had already existed, including, among other things, a real crisis now in staffing for teachers, especially around special education, and a continued sort of crisis of getting the right type of instruction to students at the right time in a way that's really going to impact growth and close learning gaps for those students. And so, without further ado, I will throw it over to Bob to introduce himself.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to Lindamood-Bell for the opportunity to talk with folks across the country today. And thanks to all the folks, hardworking educators who are taking time from their busy schedules to join us for this webinar. I've done a lot of things in my career, and I won't bore you all with the details. I was a first grade teacher, and as I've told Dave, not a very good one. And like a lot of people who fail at teaching, moved into administration. I'm a recovering superintendent, a recovering school psychologist, and a lot of different 12-step groups for a lot of different types of folks who work in the field of special ed. And I am finishing up my 50th year of doing this work. So thank you again for the introduction, and look forward to talking with you as we go forward this afternoon.
Great, and I thought we'd sort of open, Bob, by talking a little bit about kind of what the current context of reading instruction is and what's happening with learning across the country.
So as some of the people who are on the webinar undoubtedly know, there's only one test that's given across the country where you can compare the performance of the students in one state to the performance of students in another. And that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. It's given every other year to samples of 4th, 8th, and 12th graders, and it is considered the gold standard in assessment. So making sure that you understand the source of these data that we're about to talk about. And the data definitely confirm what we have known for a very long time. And that's that a third of kids come to school already reading, and we don't screw that up no matter what we do with them in public schools. A third of students will learn no matter what approach we use to teach those students how to read. But that leaves a third of students who struggle. And you can see the top point, which is more than a third of 4th graders are not reading on a basic level, which is the lowest level of performance on the NAEP. Another third are at risk for not achieving grade level expectations. And as I said a minute ago, the remaining third are those students who would learn to read no matter what instruction they've received.
Right. And a lot of this has to do, Bob, kind of with as we've discussed, what the historical models of reading instruction really are based on.
Well, sadly, for too many students, reading instruction in many schools across the country is based on the mistaken belief that if kids are read to a great deal, then reading should come pretty easily for them. So many of the folks who are on the webinar undoubtedly are aware of balanced literacy being the prevailing model that's used across the country. I've heard balanced literacy very aptly described as trying to balance two empty pans. Folks know that whole language is still in wide use, despite the amassed data that suggests that whole language is not the way to teach kids who struggle to learn how to read. And the teacher's role in other approaches is mainly to guide students to create an environment that's conducive to learning how to read, setting up reading groups, reading with students, helping them find books on their reading level. These are models that are in wide use across the country. And folks like Lucy Calkins, who's been at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York, is trying to revise her approach to teaching reading. There are a lot of folks are aware of the fact that these prevailing models that are still in wide use are not based on what we are describing now as the science of reading. That really comes, Dave, as you know, from the National Reading Panel studies that were done many years ago under the Bush administration.
Right, and it is kind of, as much as sort of the science of reading is in the discussion out there in the world of education, it is kind of jarring when you see statistics on how few teachers are actually providing reading instruction that is really based on knowledge of what the necessary components of learning how to read are. And it is encouraging, of course, that knowledge about what those necessary components are has increased. And in fact, it's increased to the point that some states are mandating that all teachers be trained in what those necessary component parts of learning how to read are. And certainly, that's a necessary piece for teachers to be able to learn. But in a lot of cases, learning what the component parts of reading are is not actually sufficient. And Bob, we've talked a lot about that as we've met with district leaders across the country over this course of the summer, but maybe you could flesh out a little bit for us about, why that reading is not quite sufficient enough in order to do what we are hoping it will do.
Kids come to school with a variety of very complex needs. And sadly, teacher preparation is not really preparing our teachers to meet the needs of too many students in classrooms across the country. As you know, Dave, I serve on the board of the National Center on Teacher Quality. It's a nonprofit. We look at the quality of teacher preparation across the country, study about 750 colleges and universities every year to determine how teachers are being prepared. And we see way too often that teachers are not learning about the science behind how students learn how to read. We have learned a great deal, particularly since the research that was done at the National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development under the leadership of Reed Lyon and the centers that were funded to study how students learn how to read. And we really have learned a great deal about how students learn how to read, why some students struggle to learn how to read, and what to do with those students who struggle. And that's based on science. And teachers are not getting the training, therefore don't develop the skills that they need to be able to implement the science and therefore help the students who are struggling to learn how to read. And I will also quickly add that I know, as you're well aware, when you're talking about the importance of professional development, we know that special ed teachers get less training on how to teach reading than their general ed counterparts. And there's a lot of concern about the quality of teacher preparation that general education teachers are receiving. And there was only one state that made significant growth on the 2019 administration of the NAEP, and that was Mississippi. And the reason that Mississippi, the attribution for the impressive gains that Mississippi made on the NAEP was the professional development that their teachers were receiving on the science of teaching reading. So there's clearly critical importance to doing a better job of training our teachers. And sadly, we have to provide a lot of professional development when they're in schools because they're not getting the training that they need in the colleges and universities that they attend.
Right. And, that training teachers often is looked at as, if we give them the grounding and what are the components of science, of the sort of the science of reading, they still ultimately have to know, okay, well, now what do I go and do, right? How do I have a program that will go out, that I can go out and implement with students so that I can actually close those gaps? So it's one thing to kind of know about what all of the pieces are. It's another thing to have an actual program and a scope and sequence and materials to work your way through.
As you well know, some of the professional development models that are in wide use are what is described as program agnostic. So they do not do what you just suggested is so important, in that they do not provide teachers with a specific program to implement as part of that professional development. And that's one of the things that differentiates the professional development that Lindamood-Bell does so well. And it's so critically important to give teachers not only the grounding in the science of how kids learn how to read, why some kids struggle to learn how to read it, and then the more important thing, what to do with those kids who are struggling, since the preceding slide showed how many students we're really talking about. And when I was teaching first grade, I was not trained well in how to teach students who were struggling to learn how to read. And sadly, that hasn't improved. And this is 50 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as you've talked about historically, and one of the reasons that you were so really passionate about making sure that we changed what was happening for students in school was that historically the assumption was, if the sort of teaching that was happening in the classroom wasn't working for a student, the issue was in the student's home. And if it wasn't in the student's home, the problem was the child. Ultimately it wasn't about the instruction that was being provided. Instead, it was about the student. And you've got kind of a great saying that you've mentioned many times before, and has really stuck with people, about what was actually happening with kids.
Well, the number one reason why kids are referred to special education across the country is their failure to learn how to read. And the second reason is behavior problems. And the number one reason why students exhibit behavior problems is because they struggle to learn how to read. And out of the 13 categories of eligibility for special education under IDEA, the largest category in school districts that are across the country, and the folks who are on the webinar can go ahead and check with their special education director to make sure that in their school district that in fact this is what's happening, is the category of kids with specific learning disabilities. And what you were alluding to, Dave, is that I often have said that those students, many of them are not students with specific learning disabilities. They are, in fact, students with ABT, which stands for that they ain't been taught. And that is all too often why these kids are struggling, is because they haven't been taught by teachers who are trained to implement a evidence-based program with fidelity and treatment integrity that's designed to teach struggling kids how to read. And the last bullet on this slide gets to the point that you made at the outset of today's webinar, and that's that the pandemic has created a new category of students who ain't been taught, and that's students who have not had a chance to learn because they haven't been in school, or they have been confined to a virtual program, which we know for too many students has not been an effective model for improving outcomes and results. And so we don't really know how significant the learning loss has been as a function of the pandemic. These are estimates based on data, because many students were not assessed because they weren't in school to take the norm referenced assessments that give us the data to know how significant the learning loss might have been. But we do think that on average, they're 5 months behind in math, 4 months behind in reading, and that we do know that the pandemic widened the pre-existing opportunity and achievement gaps between kids who are socioeconomically challenged and those students from higher socioeconomic status homes.
Yeah, and we might be about to get another window into that data, right? Because as you mentioned, A lot of schools didn't do their end of year assessments in 2021, and now did do them for 2022. And so we're going to get a chance pretty soon to see, how significant those gaps may in fact be. Right. And Bob, I know you've been very passionate in talking about what some of the longer term impacts of that missed opportunity to learn could be for students.
What we do know, Dave, is that not being able to read fundamentally changes a student's trajectory, both academically and socially, emotionally, and post-school as well. And so what we're worried about is that the fallout from the pandemic threatens to depress this generation's prospects far into the future and far into their impending adulthood. We're worried that we've constricted their opportunities because of the fact that they have not gotten the instruction that they were entitled to receive because they haven't been in school. We know that more first and second graders ended last school year 2 or more grade levels below expectations than in any previous year. And given the major strides that kids at this age typically make in mastering reading and the critical importance of early reading for later academic success, this is of particular concern. And that really relates to Joe Torgeson's important work, where he found that the amount of effort that we need to put into changing a child's trajectory after third grade is way more than the amount of effort that we could put into that changing that child's trajectory before third grade. So early intervention works. Early intervention is critically important no matter what human malady we are trying to address, and that is particularly true for reading as well.
Yeah, and obviously, teachers have grown accustomed to talking about how, K1 and 2, we're sort of learning to read, and then we pivot at third grade to reading in order to learn. We at Lindamood-Bell often talk about it as moving from the parts of reading to the whole of reading, right? And students are expected to have mastered those parts, and if they still need instruction in those parts, that's going to impact greatly their ability to access the whole of reading. And of course, that also really causes impacts beyond just looking at test scores and looking at what basic reading is happening with kids. It obviously becomes a much bigger issue. You were mentioning behavior earlier, Bob, as just one facet of the impacts that occur when students struggle to learn how to read.
The pandemic has had perhaps the most significant impact on the mental health of children in this country that we've ever seen. The recent national data are alarming in that they're saying that it could be as much as 40% of the kids in this country have had suicidal ideation. We've never seen numbers like that. Before the pandemic, the National Association of School Psychologists had published data that suggested that less than 25% of students who need mental health services in schools were receiving those mental health services. They've changed that to say now that less than 20% of students who need mental health services are receiving those mental health services in schools. And that was before the pandemic. We have a national shortage. You alluded to this earlier, Dave, about the shortage of teachers. We've got a shortage of school psychologists across the country. And we need school psychologists to be able to spend less time giving meaningless IQ tests so they can have more time to be able to spend addressing the mental health needs of students. And the pandemic has clearly exacerbated the mental health problems that students were experiencing before the pandemic. And what I'm trying to say is that RTI can be used as a paradigm for not only looking at providing different levels of intervention for kids in the academic domain, can also be used as a paradigm for meeting the behavior and mental health needs of students as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know one of the other sayings that you use a lot, Bob, is to say, under the historical model, if students are struggling in gen ed, they're going to go into special ed, and often there isn't anything particularly special that's happening in special ed, right? You mentioned before that many teachers in special ed actually receive less training in things like how to teach reading than do their general education counterparts.
The comment that I have made based on the stagnation in academic achievement for students with disabilities in the aggregate, I want to thank folks who do very important work across the country every day for students with disabilities and their family. However, when you look at the aggregate for the 7 million students who are currently receiving special education and see the stagnation in academic achievement, have to look at asking the very important and difficult question about what's so special about special education if students with disabilities are not receiving the specially designed instruction that they're entitled to receive. And I would quickly remind folks about the unanimous Supreme Court decision 2 terms ago in the Andrew decision. It's very rare to get a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court, as you all know, but that case was about the fact that students with disabilities are not receiving the educational benefit that they're entitled to receive under IDEA, and we've got to do a better job of improving outcomes and results. And clearly, we've got a lot of work still to do to meet that mandate.
And so, Bob, maybe you can take us through quickly what you feel like are some of the necessary components for a multi-tiered system of support and for RTI as a whole.
So we got RTI language, as Dave mentioned, into IDEA for the first time since 1975. That was back in 2004. Subsequent to President Bush signing IDEA, as you all know, the Education and Secondary Education Act, which began in 1965, got reauthorized when President Bush was in office, and it was called the No Child Left Behind, which some of you may remember, fondly, I hope. But then the Congress, after that, reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act again, and it was called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And in ESSA, you do not see language about response to intervention and instruction. What you see is this term, a multi-tiered system of supports. And that's really about how do we create a system which is designed to address the needs of all of the students in the school district who are struggling. And you want to base that on assessment. Got to have, if there's another way to know how kids are learning other than assessment, I don't know what it is. Can you go back to the previous slide for just a second?
About that.
Thank you very much. We want to make sure that we are making decisions based on data. I shared with you earlier about, sadly, reading instruction is too often driven by people's beliefs rather than the science. If you make, I'm a data-based policymaker, and I hope that all of you as teachers are using progress monitoring data to determine whether your students are responding effectively to the instruction that you are providing. You want to have multi-level instruction. You want to make sure that the district has the infrastructure and support that you need to implement a system of multi-tiered systems of support. And whatever program it is that you choose to use, you want to make sure that you are implementing that program with what we call fidelity, treatment integrity, and that you are in fact evaluating the impact of the services that you are providing and the interventions that you are providing to the students who are struggling.
Great. So some of the things that you want to see coming out of that sort of structure, Bob?
We want to increase, the goal is to increase academic achievement for all students. And I think it's important to remind everyone that every student with a disability is first a general education student. It's something that you were getting to earlier, Dave. And I think we often forget that, and that special ed and general ed are not two separate systems. They're actually part of the same system. And we need to have a system in place that is designed to increase academic achievement for everyone, for all students. We want to make sure we're having collaboration between general ed and special ed. We want to make sure that we have a unified framework of academics and behavioral support in place in the district and in every classroom, and that you have instructional leadership at the building level provided by the principal. You want to make sure that resources are allocated based on needs. And by the way, we've never seen as many resources particularly financial resources. We've never seen this much money in public education in the history of our country. The rescue plan and the ESSER money, these are incredibly large infusions of money into the education system. We want to make sure that the assessment that's being done is not discriminatory and that we have policies and procedures and practices in place that ensure that there's equity and that we are not discriminating against any kids. And that's why for many, many years now, I've been advocating that we spend less time giving meaningless IQ tests, because IQ is, as we know, is racially and discriminatory and does not predict subsequent academic success. And too often, as you well know, Dave, we see high rates of referrals for special education. We see districts where 25%, 30% of their students are being receiving special education services, way higher than the national numbers of 14%. So I think that these are just some reasons why we want to make sure that you all are implementing a multi-tiered systems of support in your school district.
Yeah, and it is such a continuing problem, Bob, to run into that whole thing. You sent me an article earlier this week about a board member talking about how the special education students were draining funding from our students. And there is still that conception of our students are these gen ed kids, and those students over there are somebody else's kids. Those are the other kids.
And a term that's being used, which gives you a sense, Dave, of how significant this issue is called encroachment. And that has a pejorative meaning to it. But districts are saying, because IDEA has never received the funding from Congress that was intended back in 1975, where the intent was to provide 40% of the excess costs that school districts incur in providing special education and related services to what we used to call handicapped kids, what we now call kids with disabilities. We're nowhere near that. There hasn't been a funding study done nationally in 16 years, but the estimate is that the federal share is about 16%. That's nowhere near the 40% that was promised back in 1975. So we have to take general education funds away from the general education budget in order to make sure that the mandate, the civil rights entitlement to free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment is provided to students with disabilities. And that's what sets up this antagonism and antipathy between general ed and special ed, and why I sent you that article about the board member who was stating that. I think we want to move all of the people, I would think, on the call know that 40 states have now enacted legislation to require that all students be screened for the signs and symptoms of dyslexia. That's what universal screening is all about in those 40 states. And I think the concern that folks are having in these 40 states is that we are seeing a lot of students being identified as having dyslexia. Then the question becomes, what do we do to really serve those students well and effectively? And we've already talked about the fact that sadly teachers are not trained to know what to do in too many instances. And we've got a lot of kids and the question is, are they really being appropriately identified or are they being misidentified? They really don't have dyslexia. And for those students that really do have dyslexia, we want to make sure that they are getting specially designed instruction and teachers are using evidence-based strategies with fidelity and treatment integrity.
And
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say, I love that you sort of looked at a system structure and you kind of flipped the way that people usually talk about this.
So on the one side, we talk about RTI-A, or the academic side of response to intervention and instruction. On the other side, we talk about RTI-B, which is the behavioral side of RTI. And as I was mentioning earlier, the RTI as a paradigm can be used for both academic and behavioral to address both academic and behavioral issues in kids. This is the triangle that is often used to depict graphically what RTI should look like. I would hope that people would not pay attention to the percentages that are in each one of the parts of the triangle or the pyramid, but rather realize that most students, if not all students, start out in general education. That's the green, that's the universal instruction. You want it to be preventative and proactive. Then that's tier one. Tier two is targeted group interventions for just some students. So we usually can depict this as the green would be all, the yellow would be some, the red would be few. But tier two would be for some students. You would want to use interventions with high efficiency, and you would want to make sure that the system is providing a rapid response for students who are struggling. And then tier three is intensive, individualized intervention. It can be for small groups, but it's typically, we talk about specially designed instruction for individual students. And it's really important for folks to remember that tier three is not synonymous with special education. All of the tiers are a prelude to gathering progress monitoring data to determine whether the interventions are being effective. And if you've got a student who has not responded to interventions that began in tier one, provided in tier two, continued to be more intensely individually provided in tier three, and you've gathered progress monitoring data in each one of those tiers, then you are in a very good position to be able to say that you think that the student should be referred for the comprehensive multidisciplinary evaluation that would lead to answering two questions. The first question is, does the student have a disability? And if the answer to that question is yes, then the second question is, does that student need special education? And the same thing can be said for behavior, and you can see the graphic there.
Yeah. And I think, one of a couple places where I think people run into a lot of different struggles in here, Bob, and maybe you want to talk about it more, or we can continue on the conversation. But oftentimes people really struggle, I think, with tier two and trying to figure out what a good tier two structure is. And then one of the other areas that I see a lot of struggle in is when students do get to tier three, and we're talking about trying to implement a program with fidelity. Part of that is about how much instruction students are getting and how frequently. And typically, many teachers are not necessarily tracking how much instruction in those small groups or in one-on-one settings that students are getting. And so they don't actually have a way to, at the end of the year, look at it and say, oh yeah, this student got the right amount of instruction and still wasn't making gains, right? They might have actually gotten nowhere near what was recommended in terms of the amount of instruction that they need. And so we're looking at the student and saying, again, that the problem is with the student, right? And not with the system in which they're operating.
That's a very important point, Dave. And I think that we need, at this juncture, to talk about the dose-response interaction. And people will think about any medical problems that they may have. If they go to the doctor and they have particular symptoms, and the doctor then describes medication, and if the medication is not having the desired effect, typically the doctor will increase the dosage of that medication. The same holds true in education. We do not provide a sufficient dosage of intervention to really be able to address the academic and behavioral needs of students who have significant academic and behavioral needs. And one of the things that I've always been impressed by with Lindamood-Bell and the work that you and your colleagues do, and what Nancy has done so well for so many years, is recognize that if we're going to be effective, it's high dose is what's required. And so in the clinics across the world that you all do, I know that you're talking about 4 hours a day of intervention with someone who's trained in your strategies. That's the kind of dose response interaction that we never see in public schools. The resource room model, as folks on the webinar know, we pull a kid out of the core and we then send that kid to receive a reading intervention from a teacher who's had less training on how to teach reading, and the student is missing the opportunity to get instruction in the core. And what should be happening is that the student should be staying in the core, hopefully even through osmosis, that student would get some benefit from sitting in the core instruction that's being provided. And then in either tier 2 or tier 3, then that student would receive intervention that supplements what the student is not getting out of the core program. So I think the point you made, Dave, is so critically important, and is one of the reasons why special ed is not so special for the vast majority of mildly disabled students who receive special ed across the country. And
Right.
I think the data will support that.
Yeah, and I think, the 4-hour day model is a great one. I think, and the goal of that is to make a change in a very short period of time, right? And when we partner with school districts, they're often implementing, they're fortunate to get 45 minutes or an hour a day. And so what we really emphasize to them is that they're going to need to be providing it every day to those students, 5 days a week, and figuring out, how do we change what it is that's happening in the school building so that my students are being able to get to that interventionist for that amount of time and that amount of intensity. And that's where I notice, one of those low-hanging fruit things like tracking how much actual instructional time students get can be really powerful when you compare what's happening at one site to what's happening at another. And schools can begin to learn from each other. Oh, why are the students being released for intervention enough time at this site as opposed to another? And they can begin to have those really collaborative discussions.
And the job embedded PD that you're providing and the monitoring of the interventions that the teachers are providing and looking at the fidelity of implementation is so critically important to the point you just made. It's not going to work if teachers are not, in fact, doing it the way it's intended to be delivered, and they're not trained on how to deliver that instructional program. So I think that's very important. These are quickly some guiding questions that folks can think about as they go back to their districts and classrooms after the webinar and look at their multi-tiered systems of support. Is the core program sufficient? If it's not sufficient, why isn't it? How will the needs identified in the core be addressed? How will the effectiveness and efficiency of the core be monitored over time? Have improvements to the core been effective? For what students in the core, which students in the core, is the core program sufficient and not sufficient, and why? What specific supplemental and intensive instruction is needed? And that's just what we were talking about. How are you going to identify what program you're going to provide in tier 2 and in tier 3? And then the critical importance of progress monitoring. You've got to go ahead and monitor the progress that students are making so that you know whether your intervention is in fact being effective. And if it's not, then you can change your instruction, whether it's the delivery, whether it's in fact the program, or whether it's just the intensity of it, the individuality, individuation of it. These are things that good teachers know. How will the supplemental and intensive instruction be delivered? How will effectiveness of supplemental and intensive instruction be monitored? And what students or which students need to move to a different level of instruction? Those are questions that are going to help you really move through the different tiers, because as I said, and as you all know, every student is in tier 1, but then you have those students who are struggling go into tier 2 and hopefully are making enough progress to be able to return full time to tier 1. If not, you're going to have some students who are going to need to go to more intensive instruction, and that's tier 3. And then, as I said, you will have success, hopefully, with many students. But for those students who are not having success, you're going to have sufficient data to be able to then lead to the comprehensive multidisciplinary evaluation required to determine whether the student has a disability and might need special ed.
And so, Bob, one of the responses to the fact that students have been struggling as a result of the pandemic has been an emphasis on tutoring. And I think it's really important to clarify what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about what's actually called high impact tutoring. right? That high impact tutoring is really, when you dig into the research on it, intervention, right? That it's not what folks think of historically as tutoring, which might be somebody sitting down a couple times a week, helping a kid read a paragraph, give them a pat on the head, send them on their way, or having high school students come in and help out. But that really the effective high impact tutoring programs have been intensive intervention programs. And so, I know that this was a big thing for you, so maybe you want to talk a little bit more in detail about that.
Well, I think as we wrap up the webinar today, we wanted to kind of make sure that folks understand the differentiation between tutoring and intervention, and that tutoring is not intervention. That improvements to remote and hybrid learning, by the way, have had less impact in reading than they did in math. And again, we don't really know how significant the differences have been, how much learning loss has occurred, how much learning recovery is taking place, but we are concerned about the fact that tutoring may not be achieving the kind of improvements in academic performance that is hoped. And the point that you were making about the dose-response interaction, and again, whether it's high impact or high dose, that's a difference from a lot of the ways that tutoring is being provided across the country. And folks on the webinar will remember perhaps when they received tutoring. And it was to buttress the kind of instruction that was not giving them the information that they needed when they were in school. And that's not what the students who have lost so much academic skill need in order to regain, and we're not seeing the kind of acceleration in learning because tutoring has not re-engaged students and hasn't re-enrolled them into effective learning programs, but we want to make sure that we are giving them research-based, evidence-based, proven effective interventions. We want to also make sure that we're supporting students in recovering their unfinished learning and meeting their broader needs using intervention. And this was really trying to get folks to recognize that tutoring, you mentioned high impact tutoring. I don't want to say that tutoring never works, but we want to be careful about thinking that tutoring is the kind of panacea that it is not.
And then, Bob, I know you're often, I'm often surprised sometimes when I give a presentation and I talk with folks afterwards about what they remember and how much of it they remember, et cetera. And so go for it with this one.
Well, I think as we wrap up, I want to remind people that we know that they will forget most of what they have seen and heard, that they're going to lose 80% of it within the next 2 days. But what we want to hopefully accomplish is determining what's most important for them to retain. And we've really tried to kind of talk today about the difference between RTI and MTSS. Dave was kind enough to remind you all that we did get language about response to intervention into IDEA, and that's really about a different way of identifying students with specific learning disabilities, not using the IQ achievement discrepancy model, not using a weight to fail model, but really trying to make sure that we are using failure to respond to interventions as the hallmark for identifying students with specific learning disabilities. And hopefully folks will also remember a little bit about some of the key elements to an effective multi-tiered systems of support system in their school district.
And so thank you all for joining us today for our Leaders in Literacy webinar series. I'd like to thank Dr. Pasternack for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Appreciate everyone taking out their time, taking time out of their day to watch our webinar. You could certainly visit our website, which is lblp.com or lindamood-bell.com, and click on webinars to see previous webinars that we've held with district leaders from across the country. Thank you all again for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar.